Okay, so I am Jordy Izzard. I'm Associate Director of Alumni Relations, and today's date is March 11th, 2014. And I'm here today with Allen Keiswetter, who graduated with a certificate from Bologna in 1967. And it's great to have you here, and we're just going to have a little bit of a conversation. And why don't we start with what originally brought you to SAIS?
I graduated from Dartmouth in 1966, and I was torn between an academic career and a practicing career going into the Foreign Service, and SAIS just seemed to be the perfect answer. It was a path in either direction. And then I was offered a chance to study in Bologna. And you have to understand, I grew up in Kansas. I had never been out of the country, didn't have a passport. Going from Kansas to New Hampshire to Dartmouth was a big change, and this was just the next step. So I was very excited about it because I saw this as a career move and sort of expanding my horizons. Spending a year in Europe was a wonderful enticement.
That's great. And then you were at SAIS, Bologna.
Yes.
And tell us about your experiences there as a student.
Twofold. One is an extension of the other, which was my first time abroad. So I didn't speak Italian. I spoke French, which was helpful, but not Italian. And then there was, of course, the experience, the academic experience, and the whole experience of SAIS itself. I started out thinking that I wanted to live with an Italian family, and this lasted about a month, 6 weeks, when I came down with a high fever. The Italian family didn't know what to do with me, and generally I decided it was much better to move to the dorm. So this was the beginning of a long-term friendship with many, many, many people from SAIS. I mentioned that I graduated from Dartmouth. I also spent a year at Harvard. But my close friends that have just preserved our connections over the years are from SAIS. And one of my roommates in Bologna, when I moved to the apartment, was Richard Hitchman, who was British, and he and I remained in touch, I would say, several times a year, but we've been back and forth to visit each other, and including this past summer when we visited him at Oxford. And so it was a very profound experience. It was an experience of learning with an Italian, dealing with a foreign culture, coping with that for the first time. Some of the highlights of the year were, I guess, the various trips that we took to the communities, personal trips we took. I remember Bonnie Salongo, now Bonnie Wilson, and a couple others of us went to Vienna with a friend of ours from Vienna, and we arrived there. I'd never been to Vienna before. It was wonderful. I remember Hans, our host, saying, "Here's the radio, here is the opera house." The Americans bombed it. They thought it was the railroad station. So there were lots of things like that. Academically, it was a challenge, but not in the same way that, say, Dartmouth was. And I found myself confined by not having what was then a world-class library. I mean, not having vast library available to me, and since it was the age before the internet, you just couldn't research things. So this means you had to do a lot of thought. There had to be much more of a creative purpose to it all. I remember several of the professors, but particularly Pierre Hosner, a person with whom I have remained in touch too until the last year or two. And I think they had a profound effect on me in shaping my attitudes. So I guess I do remember, maybe this is always true, there was an element of student discontent. I think this is always natural. This always happens. I'm sure there must be a yearly cycle with peaks and so on and so forth. And I was never greatly involved in it, but there was that sort of sentiment. I came away loving Italy. We've been back Italy several times since then. Back to Bologna a couple of times since then. Overall, I love the year. I guess one thing that I would just tell you, when I arrived, I flew from Kansas City to New York, from New York to Milan. And I got off Milan. I had a big suitcase, and I lugged it at the train station. And I got on the train to Bologna, but I was very jet-lagged, and I fell asleep. And I woke up, and I was in a compartment. There was an Italian family there. I knew no Italian at this point, beyond pizza, I think. And I kept saying Bologna, yes, so and so. And then they finally realized that I wanted to get off at Bologna. The train was starting to move, so they told me to run outside, and I ran outside, and they shoved my suitcase out the window as the train was pulling away. Anyway, I did not go back to Washington, SAIS, but it had nothing to do with SAIS. It had to do with other things. I was, back in those days, there was the Vietnam War. I was about to be drafted. I had applied to the Foreign Service, and I was accepted into the Foreign Service. And I knew when I joined the Foreign Service, I would still be going to Vietnam, because that's what happened to young Foreign Service officers in those days. So I decided that instead of being drafted in the military or volunteering with the military, I would join the Foreign Service, and I did. It was in.
That's how you started your career, then.
That's how I started my career.
Yeah.
And I polished my French, took some introductory courses. I did go to Vietnam, and while I was in Vietnam, I received my draft notice. And I replied back to my draft board in Kansas, I'm here. My supervisor, my supervising officer is a major. My subordinate is a lieutenant, but you can recycle me if you like. They decided to leave me there. And then after that, I went to Harvard, to the John F. Kennedy School, under a State Department program. So I'm sort of Bologna, SAIS. I did take courses at SAIS while I was here in town. I remember particularly working with Dr. Osgood, who was one of my favorites. I took a course on NATO with him. At the same time, I was on the NATO desk. So there was a nice sort of interplay there, too.
So you went to the Peace Corps.
No, I didn't go to the Peace Corps. I joined the Foreign Service.
I'm sorry, you joined the Foreign Service, and what's the timeline of when you went to Harvard in that? Were you...
Yeah, I thought that I was a European specialist, and going to SAIS in Bologna set that up. And so I joined the Foreign Service in '67. I was in Vietnam through '68, '69. I came back and spent 2 years in the Department of State in intelligence and research, working on Belgium and France largely. And I convinced the Department of State to send me to Harvard for a special program in European affairs. So I spent a year there working largely with Joe Nye and with Stanley Hoffman. Stanley Hoffman was one of my favorites.
And then what did you do after Harvard?
Well, I came back and I worked on the NATO desk for 3 years. Then this goes into my career. This wasn't my career, but I had a great career change, thanks to Henry Kissinger. He came up with globalization, but globalization had nothing to do with climate or trade. It was a personnel policy. And if you had had 2 or more years working on 2 or more tours, working on one area of the world, you were supposed to be globalized. So you would have another area. And I, in theory, had had 3 years working on Europe, or 3 tours, 1 in INR, 1 on the NATO desk, and then the year at Harvard. So I was globalized since I spoke French. The obvious place to send me was to Beirut. And this was the beginning of my Middle East career, where I spent most of my time in the Foreign Service. And since have specialized in, and I'm now a scholar at the Middle East Institute, and I teach at the University of Maryland, and I'm a consultant to Denton's international law firm on Middle Eastern affairs. So I went to Beirut. What can I say about Beirut? I got there in August. The big question in August of 1975 was whether there would be a round 4 of violence. There had been rounds 1, 2, 3, and it was 4. We were there in the ceasefire period, and the answer in September turned out to be yes, and it lasted 15 years. And I was eventually evacuated in January. I have to say my parents were quite concerned about me, and there weren't good communications. But there was a film crew there that filmed the evacuation, and they were watching television in Great Bend, Kansas. And there I was, loading the luggage. And since this was not readily available in what would that been, 75, 76, they went out to the television station so they could see it again, make sure what they saw was true. From there I went to Baghdad. I studied, I came back, I worked for the Secretary of Vance's staff on Middle Eastern affairs. Was one of the special assistants, the executive secretariat. Then I studied Arabic for a couple of years, including a year in Tunis. That led to Khartoum, and Khartoum led to Sana'a, where I was DCM, Deputy Ambassador, and this led to Riyadh, and I ended up coming back then to Washington, where I spent several years of working on various, office director of both of regional affairs and NEA and the Near East Bureau, and also for the Arab Peninsula affairs. I was the office director. This was the time of the first Gulf War. It was the time of the beginning of the Middle East peace process in 1991. I chaired the Middle East Working Group on Water Resources, and one little anecdote, at the first meeting it was all wired that the Americans would chair. It turned out that Dirigen, the Assistant Secretary who was supposed to chair, couldn't because he had to be with Secretary Vance. So he asked me to, and I chaired it, and I chaired it for the next 3 years. But the issue at the beginning was, what would I be called? The Arabs wanted nothing that would be translated as Rais, that is, so you can't use chairman, president, or any of those things. So I suggested gavel holder. And till this day, in the Middle East peace process, they don't have chairman or co-chair or anything, they have gavel holders. So it was my lasting contribution to the peace process. Also, of the 5 working groups that were formed, the Middle East Working Group on Water Resources is the only one that still continues.
Wow, that's really terrific.
Yeah.
You were a gavel holder.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, that's great. And so when did you end your career then, I guess, in the Middle East?
Well, I was my career in the Middle East, the peak I suspect was when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, for the Near Eastern affairs. There are, 21 countries in what's called NEA, and I was in charge of 14 of them. this included Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all of the Arab Peninsula, all of North Africa, particularly Libya, Algeria. I called myself the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Miscreants. So it was really an exciting time, and there were sort of two levels. I was involved with the first attempts to have secret negotiations with the Iranians. This didn't work out at 3 different times. We, through the UN auspices, had made contacts and arrangements were made that we should meet, once in Geneva, once in London, once in New York. But the same thing happened. A couple of days beforehand, we'd get a call from Johnny Pico, who was the Secretary General's special assistant, saying, well, sorry, the Iranians can't come. And what had happened is, at this time, Khatami was the president, and the issue would perk up the chain of command, and then it would finally get to the supreme leader, Khomeini, and at that point, he would say no. So that added excitement. But I think the things that I enjoyed most was sort of where I could be in charge. Mm-hmm. And there was a problem. In the 1970s, the Polisario took as prisoner several hundred Moroccan troops over a dispute of the Western Sahara. And it fell on my bailiwick. And there had been a UN report that said that these people had suffered from dementia, they had all sorts of psychological problems, and somebody should negotiate the release, intervene, and there was some congressional pressure too, and I had to testify on the topic, so I was the obvious choice to go negotiate this. And it was all done under the auspices of James Baker, who had also been, at this point, not Secretary of State, because he was beyond, he was already retired, but he was the Secretary General's special representative for the Western Sahara. So it was sort of a joint appointment of U.S. government plus international UN auspices. And I flew and talked to the new King of Morocco, King Mohammed VI, and he was willing to welcome back these prisoners because his father had said they were all drunkards and lazy and didn't want to see them again. And I flew then to Algeria, and because the Algerians support the Polisario. And they were supportive, and they provided a plane to take me down to Tindouf, which is way down in the southern part of Algeria, next to the Moroccan border. And I spent a little more than a day with the tribal sheikhs, the shayukh. And after several hours of conversation, they agreed they should release some of them. And they eventually released 212 of them. But at the end, there was a big celebration. It was the evening, and I was dressed in these tribal robes, black and white, and they brought up this baby camel and gave it to me as a gift for my good work. Now, just probably a little beyond arm's length was the baby camel's mother, who was none too happy about this arrangement. So I thanked them very politely and said that I thought the baby camel needed his mother, and that it's all I understood part of the hospital herd, and I would like to make this a contribution to the hospital. So, besides, I didn't think I could get a baby camel onto the plane. So I enjoyed that. After that, I taught at the National War College. I taught at the National Defense College, the National Defense Intelligence College. And since then, I have become very active in various civic organizations. I raised $6 million for our church for a new wing, and I also chaired the building committee. And we have a transgender son, Asa. And we've been very, very active in PFLAG, parents and friends of, family and friends of lesbians and gays in this regard. So I think that's sort of it in a nutshell.
That's great. And looking back at this illustrious career and life you have, wow, not many people can say they've worked in the number of countries that you have at that level. But looking back at current students today at SAIS, what advice might you have for them?
Well, one of the greatest gifts in life is to do something that you love. And if you are fortunate enough to do that, it's a wonderful blessing. So I guess my first advice is sometimes hard to find what you really love to do. Mm-hmm. And I would have to just cite the case of our daughter, who is graduated in 2004 and only discovered what she really liked to do in the past couple of years, so it may take some time. And if what people want to do, or what their students want to do, relates to international affairs, whether it's on the academic side or on the professional side, on the practicing side, SAIS is a wonderful place to launch. It really is. Lots of connections. I'm surprised at how many of my colleagues have graduated from SAIS or have some other connection from SAIS. And you might end up doing exactly what I did. You can start out thinking that you're, as I did, think you're going in to join the Foreign Service for 3 or 4 years, and then I'm going to get my PhD, and then I'm going to come back and teach. Well, that slice turned out to be 36 years long, and I did end up coming back and teaching. And so I guess I would encourage people to find what they love, give their heart to it, and I think they would be blessed in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much for being with us today, and we really enjoyed hearing your story.